the best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said he would be willing to resign from his post in exchange for peace in Ukraine or NATO membership. Zelenskyy's comments come ahead of the third anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and amid rising tensions with U.S. President Donald Trump. Now, Mr. Trump called Zelenskyy a dictator without elections last week and falsely claimed Zelenskyy had a 4% approval rating. Now, will the Ukrainian president relinquish his position, and what will that mean for Ukraine's future with NATO and its long-term security? Well, joining us today to tell us more is Dr. Alexey Muraviev, who is the Associate Professor of National Security and Strategic Studies at Curtin University. Hello, Dr. Muraviev. Welcome to the show.
Great to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Muraviev, what is your interpretation of President Zelensky's statement to step down in exchange for peace in Ukraine of NATO membership? Is this a desperate plea?
Look, I wouldn't be taking this comment by President Zelensky on face value because he's been saying lots of things lately, and clearly we see a very interesting and unorthodox way of carrying out some sort of bargaining game here because his escalation of rhetoric towards President Trump, which is very unusual for the country that is entirely dependent on the United States as the principal security guarantor, principal financial donor, is something out of this world. Equally, it's been very unusual to see U.S. president openly finger-pointing and bad-mouthing about one of its proxies, one of its key strategic partners. Because everything is sort of happening in this public domain, I wouldn't be really surprised if Zelensky sort of referral to him willing to leave the office in exchange for peace for Ukraine is part of this bargaining game, because it's not just about, what we need to understand, it's not just about Ukrainian president trying to actually create some sort of security guarantee for Ukraine. He is also trying to have guarantees for himself and his personal future. And given the fact that Trump effectively bluntly said that he needs to go, he needs to leave, perhaps it's a way for Zelensky to simply come around and say, okay, I may be willing to leave, but let's just talk some sort of a trade deal here.
Right. Well, Zelensky's statement about stepping down for peace has sparked intense reactions. Do you think this is a realistic bargaining chip, or could it backfire diplomatically?
Well, I think what we see right now is something that's already backfiring diplomatically, because we need to understand Ukraine is in a state of war. Zelensky is the supreme commander-in-chief. He can't simply pack his bags and go. There should be a transition period. There should be a handover of power, and the big question is to whom? He cannot hand it over to, for example, head of Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, simply because it would break the chain of command, and it may add to the demoralizing effect on the Ukrainian fighting troops, in addition to all the commentary that is currently coming out of Washington, which effectively says, Ukraine, your war is your business, or it's Europe's business, it's not our business. So once again, we need to understand the rhetoric coming from a politician, and we need to bear in mind that Zelensky is not a very experienced politician. He had a rapid rise in his political career shortly before the breakout of hostilities with the Russians, and I think this sort of lack of political maturity, and I'm not talking about his age maturity, but as being an experienced politician versus being a showman, someone who can capture the audience on stage by saying something funny or being charismatic, creates a bit of a different reaction. So even if Zelensky is serious about leaving, well, the question is whom he is going to hand over power to. I can see a potential candidate, which is former chief of Ukrainian armed forces, General Valery Zaluzhny, who was fired by Zelensky and effectively dispatched to London as Ukraine's ambassador because his popularity is far stronger than Zelensky, and he is considered to be the likely presidential candidate, or at least the strongest competitor to Zelensky. But again, we haven't really seen any indicators that Zaluzhny is ready to return back to Kyiv and assume power from the president. Right. So I would still treat it with a bit of a caution.
Okay. Well, his willingness to leave office for peace negotiations, suggest a degree of pragmatism. What does this say about his priorities in navigating the war?
Well, that's a mystery because Zelensky refuses to effectively suspend hostilities because for him, the end of the war may actually be a crisis for his leadership. There is a risk that he will lose power as a result of the war. And we also need to remember one more thing. Zelensky signed a decree that he is not going to enter any form of negotiations with Russia's President Vladimir Putin. And that effectively, because of his own making, excludes him from any form of political negotiations directly with the Russians, which is an inevitable process if you want to settle down the conflict between the two warring parties. So perhaps this whole rhetoric about him leaving is not just the result of Trump pressuring Zelensky because he understands that Zelensky cannot now legally talk to the Russians, leave alone sign decree, simply because he, as President Zelensky, signed decree banning himself from doing this. So it's an attempt to remove the legal obstacle, without placing Zelensky in an awkward position when he will have to talk to the Russian president, whom he obviously been very categorical and very harsh in his rhetoric. And I'm sure in a situation when the Ukrainian military is retreating and the Russians have the upper hand, which is another important element to bear in mind when it comes to peace negotiations, it would be pretty embarrassing for him to face Putin, despite all the rhetoric that Putin is afraid of him, Putin is afraid of Trump, etc. So we're actually in the midst of a very unusual way of seeing affairs unfolding between the two allies, and at the same time, lots of rules that establish rules on how you engage in sensitive negotiations and in sensitive sort of communications, especially when it comes down to finishing the conflict, are now being put on the front stage. So this is a very unorthodox situation in many ways.
I see. What do the people of Ukraine think about this, though? Do they want their president to step down? If so, who? I mean, you did mention who could successfully replace them, but, what do the people of Ukraine think?
Look, I mean, this is a really important question. Clearly, Zelensky doesn't have 4% rating approval as Trump effectively finger-pointed. He has higher than that, but he doesn't have over 50% either. There's been a number of opinion polls released by the Ukrainian institution shortly after this war of words began, and they show Zelensky approval rating sitting in the range of 30 to maybe 16% at worst. Clearly, if elections were to be held, say, today or tomorrow, it would be Valery Zelenskyy, the former chief of Ukrainian armed forces, as I mentioned a little while ago, that would come out victorious, and Zelensky would probably suffer defeat in the first round of presidential elections. By and large, and that's according to the Ukrainian media, because there's been a lot of opinion polls released, including people being asked this question on the streets. By and large, Ukrainians are suffering from battle fatigue. They are tired of the war. They're tired of being afraid. They want the hostilities to come to an end. They're ready to effectively see some sort of armistice, a ceasefire, as long as killing would stop, as long as bombardment of the Ukrainian cities would stop. And certainly when it comes down to people's reaction to whatever Zelensky is saying, some continue to be his staunch supporters, because we need to recognize at the time of Russia's invasion, at the time when Russian forces were on the outskirts of Kyiv within days of invading the country, Zelensky did not flee. He stayed put in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, and that, I think, had a very important and significant morale boost on Ukrainian resistance.
Right.
The fact that he didn't serve in the Ukrainian military a single day, yet he effectively chose to stay with his people. He didn't choose to leave or flee or, move to a more secure location. It's something that I think many Ukrainians remember, and we need to obviously remember that.
Right.
But 3 years down the track, clearly they're getting tired of seeing him. They're getting tired of seem this never-ending process, especially never-ending promise that Ukraine will come out of this war victorious, that a little bit more tide of events will turn in Ukraine's favor, etc., etc. So I think whilst there would be those who would forever remember and grateful to what Zelensky did for the country, I think many people actually want to see a change, also because they're simply tired of the war, and clearly they don't see that Zelensky have the political courage or the will to actually take a step forward and start saying, all right, let's just stop this, because Ukraine is suffering as much as the Russians, probably even more. It loses people, it loses territory, it loses infrastructure, and now it faces a very uncertain future about who is going to pay for the costs, who is going to cover the bill for the post-war reconstruction, which obviously on the minds of many Ukrainians right now.
I see. Well, Zelensky has also faced fierce criticism from the new U.S. administration, with U.S. President Donald Trump branding him a dictator. But in light of recent remarks by Trump, Zelensky is seeking a meeting before Trump meets Putin. What do you think the significance of this proposed meeting could be in terms of shaping U.S.-Ukraine relations?
Look, I don't think it would have any significant impact, because clearly Trump has personal quarrels with Zelensky. Trump will not forgive Zelensky for openly backing up the Democrats. If you recall last year's presidential campaign in the United States and Zelensky trip to the United States when he toured arms manufacturing facility in Pennsylvania, at that time the Republicans openly accused Zelensky and his office of sidelining with the Democrats, of intervening in U.S. presidential elections by trying to influence the outcomes of presidential elections in favor of Kamala Harris. Trump would not forgive Zelensky for refusing to investigate businesses of the Biden's family in Ukraine under his first term, because Zelensky initially promised assistance to Trump and then refused to do it when he was pressed by the Democrats. And I don't think Trump has a lot of respect for him, which obviously comes across in his remarks about being some sort of a modestly performing actor, becoming president. Now he openly says that Zelensky is a dictator. It's not a sign that Trump has any respect for him. And obviously Trump is the person that would only pay attention to people whom he respects, whom he recognizes as either equals or at least of the same caliber as him. So, and we need to understand that Trump is not just trying to finish the war in Ukraine, because it's not his war. In Trump's way, he tries to use, this is the war that was launched by Joe Biden, and that's why he keeps referring to Biden and as an instigator of the conflict, as someone who is responsible for the war starting in the first place. For him, Ukraine doesn't have the same sacred meaning as for Biden and the Democrats. He wants to focus on China. He wants to focus on in the Pacific, and also he wants to start rebuilding relations with a nuclear superpower, which is Russia. So the conversation between Washington and Moscow is not just about Ukraine. In fact, Ukraine is not the first discussion point, because the Russians and Americans have so much to talk about in terms of nuclear arms reduction, strategic stability, the Arctic, China, Middle East. The list goes on, and it's endless. And even restoring sort of normal communication, the work of diplomatic establishments in both the United States and Russia. And that's why Trump doesn't need anyone else in the room. He wants to fix this issue with the Russians first. Obviously, he wants to close this chapter on the Ukrainian war, which is incredibly bloody and incredibly costly. And then he wants to move to other parties who are directly involved in the conflict, which is the Ukrainians and the Europeans. But I think in the eyes of Trump, he returns back to the old-time classical great power politics. He considers ranking of countries. He considers ranking of who represents what country. And for him, Ukraine is not a major power. It's a middle power. It's a dependent power. And I don't think he thinks of Europe as a collective of major powers. I think he actually, in his view, downgrades Europe down to the status of a middle power. That's why his kind of bullish approach is, let's big boys talk first, and then we'll invite others to join this elite club. And I think that's where this whole dilemma is happening. So whether Zelensky will end up meeting with Trump before Trump will see Putin or not, I don't think it will actually change Trump's current trajectory, which I have outlined a little while earlier to you.
I see. I mean, this all comes as Zelensky has been calling for Ukraine to be given NATO membership as part of any deal to end the war. But the Washington-led alliance has been reluctant to make a pledge. Do you believe that NATO membership is the key to securing Ukraine's long-term security and stability? And will they accept this membership of Ukraine being part of NATO if Zelensky, steps down?
I have serious doubts that NATO has any serious appetite to have Ukraine right now. Ukraine is bleeding. Ukraine is in the middle of the war. Ukraine has lost territory. Ukraine has lost lots of people. Ukraine has the most probably combat experienced army in Europe outside of Russia, which is a massive advantage to NATO because NATO is not prepared and it's not ready to fight a major war. So in this sense, Ukraine can come in as a very experienced and battle-hardened player. But NATO is not going to invest in a war-torn country, in a country that is very divided, in a country that really, first of all, in the middle of the war. Even if war will stop tomorrow, Ukraine would still be considered to be a hotspot because if Russia will keep all territories that they seized from Ukraine, I don't think Ukraine will recognize it.
Right.
So it's going to be a frozen conflict, and NATO is not going to risk to be drawn into a fight with a nuclear superpower. And that's just Ukraine-NATO relations. There is obviously a separate issue concerning how Russia looks at Ukraine. I don't think Russia wants to occupy the whole of Ukraine, but Russia wants a buffer. Ukraine to play a role of a buffer between Russia and NATO. And if NATO's membership will be ever extended to Ukraine, Russia will go all the way and occupy the rest of Ukraine. There is no doubt about that. I think they made it very clear. Putin made it very clear. It's one of those non-negotiable red lines that the Kremlin is not prepared to compromise. And I think Europe understands it. I think the United States understands it. And that's why they don't think that, as sad as it sounds, because we need to recognize the ultimate sacrifice and the courage of the Ukrainian people who have put on an incredible resistance over the past 3 years.
I see.
But from the point of view, I think the Americans, maybe Europeans will come around. It's not worth it. It's not worth it. It's not worth the risk. And we also need to understand that NATO is not united on Ukraine's potential membership. Countries like Hungary, like Slovakia, even Germany up until recently were opposing Ukraine's NATO membership. So again, we need to differentiate what politicians are saying in public, including as part of the narrative of their public rhetoric, and what's happening in reality. And I think the two not necessarily are sort of exactly what the story is. There will be two different variants.
I see. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Muraviev, for your time and your insights today.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was Dr. Alexey Muraviev, who is the Associate Professor of National Security and Strategic Studies at Curtin University. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.